In October 1962, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. For nearly 2 weeks, the fate of humanity seemed to hang by a thread, as ordinary people everywhere anxiously followed the news, fearing that any moment could bring disaster. The tension was palpable, not just in the halls of power, but in homes, schools, and workplaces across the globe. For 13 tense days, the United States and the Soviet Union faced off over Soviet nuclear missiles discovered in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. The world watched as the two superpowers engaged in a high-stakes confrontation, with the threat of nuclear annihilation looming over every decision. The presence of these missiles so close to American soil was a chilling reminder of how quickly the Cold War could turn hot. The U.S. military went to DEFCON 2, the highest state of readiness ever reached during the Cold War, just one step away from nuclear war. Bombers armed with nuclear weapons circled the skies, ready to strike at a moment's notice. Across the world, governments and citizens alike held their breath, aware that a single miscalculation could unleash unimaginable destruction. The crisis began quietly, with a U-2 spy plane capturing photos of Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba. These grainy images, developed in secret, revealed a terrifying truth. The Soviets were building the capacity to launch nuclear strikes against the United States from just across the water. The discovery set off a chain reaction of urgent meetings and secret deliberations in Washington. These missiles could strike major U.S. cities within minutes, fundamentally shifting the balance of power and forcing President Kennedy into a dire dilemma. The threat was immediate and existential, leaving little time for careful consideration. Every option carried enormous risks, and the world's safety depended on the choices made in those tense hours. To do nothing risked emboldening the Soviets. It could signal weakness and invite further aggression. Yet any aggressive move could provoke a devastating response from Moscow, escalating the crisis beyond control. To attack could trigger nuclear war, with catastrophic consequences for both nations and the entire world. The possibility of mutual destruction was real, and the stakes could not have been higher. Kennedy's advisors, the ExComm, met in secret, weighing every move against the risk of global catastrophe. They debated options late into the night, from airstrikes to blockades, searching for a solution that could avert disaster without surrendering to Soviet demands. The fate of millions rested on the decisions of Kennedy and Khrushchev, each navigating immense pressure and the ever-present threat of a fatal miscalculation. Both leaders faced not only the expectations of their own people, but also the weight of history, knowing that their choices could shape the world for generations to come. The world's future hung in the balance as the two superpowers stared each other down, hour by hour, decision by decision. In those 13 days, the world learned just how close it could come to the edge, and how vital, wise, courageous leadership can be in the face of unimaginable danger. The discovery of the missiles was a mix of technology, intelligence, and luck. U-2 spy planes flying high above Cuba captured images that revealed Soviet missile sites being built. Analysts quickly identified launch pads and equipment for nuclear missiles capable of striking much of the U.S. within minutes. The shock in Washington was immediate. President Kennedy was shown the photos and convened his top advisors. The administration kept the discovery secret at first, buying time to consider options and avoid panic. Khrushchev's motives were complex: to close the missile gap, protect Cuba, and gain leverage in the Cold War. The placement of missiles in Cuba was a bold provocation, forcing the U.S. to respond. The world was suddenly closer to nuclear war than ever before. The clock was ticking. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the dramatic climax of years of escalating Cold War tension, a moment when the world held its breath, fearing the outbreak of nuclear war. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, but instead of cooperation, they became bitter rivals. Their competition was not just military but ideological: democracy versus communism, freedom versus control. Both nations poured resources into building up their militaries, racing to develop more powerful nuclear weapons and influence countries around the globe. The result was a terrifying stockpile of nuclear arms. Each side possessed enough firepower to destroy the planet many times over, creating a tense and uneasy peace known as mutually assured destruction. The world lived under the constant shadow of annihilation, with ordinary people practicing nuclear drills and governments preparing for the worst. In this climate, Cuba became a critical flashpoint. After Fidel Castro's communist revolution in 1959, the island nation aligned itself with the Soviet Union. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, backed by the US, only deepened the divide and pushed Cuba further into the Soviet sphere. The Soviets, seeing US hostility toward Cuba as a direct threat, decided to secretly place nuclear missiles on the island. Their goal was to deter another American invasion and to shift the balance of power in their favor, bringing the threat of nuclear war right to America's doorstep. By 1962, global tensions were already at a breaking point. The Berlin Wall had split Europe in two, symbolizing the deep divide between East and West. Both President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev were determined to defend their nation's interests, unwilling to show weakness on the world stage. Khrushchev's bold decision to deploy missiles in Cuba was a direct challenge to US dominance in the Western Hemisphere. The proximity of these weapons to American cities heightened the sense of danger and urgency in Washington. The world became a tinderbox, with fear and uncertainty spreading across continents. When American spy planes discovered the missile sites, the news sent shockwaves through governments and ordinary citizens alike, igniting a crisis that threatened to spiral out of control. The stage was set for a confrontation with global consequences as leaders on both sides faced the most dangerous standoff in human history. With the missile threat confirmed, Kennedy's ex-com faced impossible choices. Military leaders pushed for airstrikes and invasion, arguing that anything less would show weakness. Civilian advisors, including Robert Kennedy and Robert McNamara, warned that an attack could trigger nuclear war. The risk even one missed missile could devastate an American city. Kennedy encouraged open debate, determined to avoid the mistakes of the Bay of Pigs. The options: do nothing, negotiate, blockade, airstrikes or invasion, each with grave risks. Kennedy chose a naval blockade or quarantine to prevent more missiles from reaching Cuba and buy time for diplomacy. It was a show of strength without immediate violence, keeping the door open for negotiation. The world watched as the US prepared to confront the Soviets at sea. The next move would determine the fate of millions. On October 22, Kennedy addressed the nation, revealing the missile sites and announcing a naval quarantine of Cuba. US warships formed a blockade, ready to intercept Soviet vessels. The world watched as Soviet ships approached the quarantine line. Would they stop, or would war erupt at sea? Khrushchev faced pressure to challenge the blockade, but he hesitated, aware of the risks. At the last moment, Soviet ships carrying military cargo turned back, offering a glimmer of hope. The blockade stopped new weapons, but the missiles already in Cuba remained a threat. The US military stayed on high alert, and reconnaissance flights continued. The crisis was far from over, the risk of war remained high. The quarantine was a holding action, buying precious time for a diplomatic solution. The world waited, anxious and uncertain. The next days would be the most dangerous of the entire crisis. As the blockade held firm, the world watched with bated breath as the Cuban Missile Crisis reached its most dangerous point on what would become known as Black Saturday, October 27, 1962. Tensions were at an all-time high, and every decision carried the weight of possible catastrophe. On the ground in Cuba, Soviet missile crews worked frantically, racing against the clock to make their missile sites operational. The sense of urgency was palpable, as each hour that passed increased the risk of a US military strike. That day, a US U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, killing its pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson. This tragic incident marked a major escalation, bringing the superpowers even closer to the brink of war. Inside the White House, President Kennedy's advisors urged him to retaliate immediately, fearing that any hesitation would be seen as weakness. But Kennedy hesitated, deeply aware that a single misstep could unleash uncontrollable escalation and possibly nuclear war. Meanwhile, in a chilling twist, another U-2 accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace near the North Pole. Soviet fighters scrambled to intercept, and for a tense moment, the world stood on the edge of a nuclear dogfight. In the Atlantic Ocean, a US Navy destroyer forced a Soviet submarine to surface, not realizing it was armed with a nuclear torpedo. The crew inside the submarine debated whether to launch, believing war might have already begun. Only the calm restraint of one Soviet officer, Vasily Arkhipov, prevented disaster. His refusal to authorize the launch of the nuclear torpedo may have saved the world from destruction. Black Saturday revealed just how close humanity had come to nuclear war. The world held its breath, knowing that a single mistake, a single misunderstanding, could have meant the end of civilization as we know it. Both President Kennedy and Soviet Premier Khrushchev realized the terrifying reality. They had to find a way out, and they had to do it quickly, before events spiraled beyond anyone's control. The world teetered on the very edge of annihilation, with millions anxiously awaiting news, fearing the worst. The search for a peaceful solution became more urgent than ever, as leaders on both sides raced against time to pull the world back from the brink. While the world watched the standoff, secret back-channel talks began between Washington and Moscow. Formal diplomacy was too slow. Both sides needed a way to communicate quickly and honestly. Khrushchev sent Kennedy a letter offering to remove the missiles if the US pledged not to invade Cuba. The next day, a tougher letter arrived, demanding the US also remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The ex-com debated, should they accept, reject, or try to split the difference? The US decided to publicly accept the first, more conciliatory offer, while addressing the Turkey missiles in secret. Robert Kennedy met secretly with Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin to deliver this message. The fate of the world now hinged on these secret negotiations. The secret meeting between Robert Kennedy and Ambassador Dobrynin was the turning point. Publicly, the US agreed not to invade Cuba if the Soviets removed their missiles. Privately, the US promised to quietly remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey after the crisis. This face-saving deal allowed both leaders to claim victory and step back from the brink. On October 28, Khrushchev announced the Soviet missiles would be withdrawn from Cuba. The world breathed a sigh of relief. The immediate crisis was over. US surveillance confirmed the missiles were removed and the quarantine ended. A few months later, the US quietly dismantled its Jupiter missiles in Turkey. The secret deal had averted nuclear war. Diplomacy, not force, had saved the world. The Cuban Missile Crisis changed the world's understanding of peace and nuclear danger. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev realized how close they'd come to disaster and sought ways to prevent future crises. The Moscow-Washington hotline was established, allowing direct communication in emergencies. The crisis spurred arms control talks, leading to the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. The experience made both superpowers more cautious, recognizing that nuclear war could never be won. The secret deal over Turkey's missiles showed the need for creative, face-saving solutions. The lesson in the nuclear age, restraint and diplomacy are the true measures of strength. The world survived those 13 days because leaders chose wisdom over war.